So it's been really exciting to have a lot of different conversations here, and for me, one of the things I'm enjoying most is seeing and hearing some common threads emerging. And one of those threads is really this kind of question of how do we stabilize or maintain something like a state of flourishing or health that seems to be inherently dynamic. In fact, that seems to kind of necessitate or require constant change, right? If we were to really grasp at something or grab something and create a sense of restriction or stagnation around it, almost by definition, we would be, in a sense, snuffing it out. So I gave a lot of thought as I was thinking through what I would talk about today, to the work that I do and what it is I'm really trying to do. And in a way, it involves some paradoxes. It involves stabilizing or maintaining or sustaining a certain state. In my case, it's a state of good health, while at the same time allowing for nature to take its course. So the title of this talk, I realize, is a little bit of a misnomer. The subtitle is Train Your Brain to Heal Your Body. And I just want to mention, it's not really, when we talk about brain training, and we'll get a little bit deeper into my story and into neuroplasticity today, it isn't really that the brain is doing the healing. This isn't like thinking yourself well and then it happens. There's some of that, but it's not quite the way it happens. Instead, as I've really come to learn and understand it, it's much more that health is a natural state of being. Health is the state that will naturally resume whenever the conditions permit. There's a great saying in physics that the potential will always convert to the actual whenever the right conditions prevail. And so if we think of our role as healers or as people or beings that are trying to flourish, it's not that we're doing the flourishing. Instead, it's much more that we can think of ourselves almost like farmers, like cultivators. And when it comes to brain training or neuroplasticity, this seems to be a pretty accurate and on-point perspective, because brain training is very much a process of cultivation that involves literally what they call pruning away old neurons, neural connections that don't really support our well-being, and then forging or sort of tilling the soil and setting the stage for new ones to take place and take hold that can lead to better outcomes. I thought I would give a little bit of an example here. So ideally, we would start off with putting ourselves in a state of flourishing, but I'm going to start off just prior to that here. And I want you to just take a moment again, kind of like we did yesterday, loosen up, get in touch with your body. We'll try a little experiment here. And like we did yesterday, I want you to just kind of turn your awareness inward. And this can be tuning into your sensations in your body, any thoughts or feelings that you might be having. And particularly, I want you to tune into anything that's making you feel what I call anything less than pleasant. So anything that's giving you a little bit of discomfort. Now, don't tune into it too deeply. Just see if you can kind of land on what it might be. And as soon as you have it, just start to slowly nod your head. Let me know you've kind of found it. Okay, I'm seeing most heads nodding here. Okay, so now that you know what it is, I want you to bring up your hands, palms facing out in front of you, and just say the word pause. Pause. Great. Now slowly turn your palms facing inward. And imagine for a moment that whatever that sense of discomfort was or is, it's not so much in your body. It's not taking up your whole spectrum of experience. Instead, you've kind of put it out in your hands. It's not you. It's just sensations. And so now that it's kind of in your hands, you can think of it as you've trapped it in a balloon, or some people like to think they have it on a piece of paper or something. You can start to move it away from you. So move your hands away. At the same time, see if you can maintain a sense of relaxation in your shoulders. And exhale. And now I want you to bring your hands closer together. Imagine you're shrinking this sensation down, not scrunching it down, just merely choosing to make it smaller, less significant. And on the count of 3, we're going to swipe it over to the left-hand side and stick it on the wall over there. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Good. Shake it off. Take a breath. How are you feeling? You feel a little bit lighter? A little bit freer? Okay. Last year, there was a really interesting article that came out and a study that was done at Ohio University. And the title of this article caught my attention. It was called, said, "Dwelling on Stressful Events Increases Inflammation in the Body." And here's what they did. They took some seniors and they subjected them to a very, very difficult thesis defense. They asked the professors to be really hard on them, like really grill them on every single point. And just kind of give them a mild, to moderate traumatic experience. Friendly, I know. Then they took these students and they split them off into two categories. They have a laboratory there. And two groups. One of the groups, they asked to ruminate on what had just happened, right? Just play it over and over again in their mind. And they measured all different sorts of parameters, one of them being C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation in the body. And what they found, not totally surprising, I suppose, is that as they were ruminating on this, levels of inflammation were increasing long after the event, for hours after the event. Now, the second group, they asked them to simply withdraw their attention from what had happened and literally place it anywhere else. So not even imagining that they're on a beach in Hawaii or something, although that sounds great, but they actually, the instructions that they gave to them was just imagine that you're wandering up and down grocery store aisles, right? So like the most mundane thing you can think of, whatever it is, doesn't really matter, just not that. And what they found when they took the same measurements is that levels of inflammation started to slowly decline and then rapidly decline. And after about 90 minutes, they were pretty much back to baseline. Now here's the really interesting part, and where neuroplasticity gets involved, is that about 4 weeks later, they called these groups back into the lab, and they had them recall or recount the stressful event, that lovely thesis defense that they did. And they measured them again, and they found that the first group that had ruminated on it just afterward had an immediate spike in C-reactive protein. All of that inflammation, the traumatic experience, and the emotions associated with it came right back as if they were actually there now. And the second group that had thought about the supermarket aisles, they could actually vividly recount every single aspect of the event, but they had no physiologic or emotional reaction to it. So they were seeing it and able to kind of recall everything, but do it from a sort of clean place, not getting tied into it. And this is because, as we'll see, the brain really serves many functions. The number one function is survival. It's evolved over millions of years to protect us. And in this day and age, it can't really tell the difference between a threat, a physical threat, like being chased by, if you were charged by a reindeer. I heard it doesn't happen, but if it did, you'd mount the threat response. But in this day and age, it can't really tell the difference between something like that and something like an emotional challenge, or being criticized. Worrying about something has a similar effect physiologically. And so the second order of business of the brain is that it's always striving for efficiency. It wants to learn from the past to protect us in the future. And it does this by making associations, by making essentially shortcuts in the brain. And up until about 2 decades ago, it was thought that the brain was completely static, meaning it's like this software thing, but it just kind of stays, and over lifetime where neurons are declining. And then it was discovered that actually we're constantly generating new neurons through a process called neurogenesis. And our brain, which has about 86 billion different neurons, each with about 10,000 up to 10,000 synaptic connections, basically means that there is infinite possibilities for how our brain can configure itself, and also that it's constantly rewiring itself. And it's doing this based on our experiences and our relationship to those experiences. So if we have an experience that induces this physiologic response and we ruminate on that, we're basically solidifying those neural pathways that are leading to that state of discomfort, inflammation, emotional reaction, and all the rest. If we can step back into, and it was interesting at dinner last night, I was having a conversation with Martin, similarities between this type of approach and meditation. If we can step into a bigger context, meaning we take a pause, we minimize the thing, not ignore it, that's very important, we're not ignoring or suppressing it, we're simply putting it in perspective by taking a step back. Now we've stepped into a broader context. Now we have a choice. We can choose to continue to focus on and attend to the thing that is challenging us and troubling us, or we can choose to focus our attention elsewhere, anywhere else. And sure, it could be something mundane, but it could also be something of our own choosing. We can essentially replace where our awareness goes onto something that can help us to feel more pleasant in the present. So I thought I'll go a little bit deeper today into sharing my story and experience, and we'll talk about neuroplasticity and how to do it at the end. But ultimately, keep in mind really what it all comes down to is changing our relationship, changing our associations between the things that are challenging us. And yesterday we learned some of the ways that we can shift from a kind of overwhelmed or stress response into more of a rhythmic flow, into a state of calm. Today, what I hope that we can take away is learning that it's also possible to get into this state even in the face of the things that are challenging us, sometimes really challenging us. And that by practicing this repeatedly, two interesting things happen. Number one, our brain makes a new association that allows us to retain or at least regain that state more often of the time. And number two, and this is my favorite part, is when we start to practice this, the landscape changes. The world starts to change in such a way where rather than seeing the things and experiencing things in our environment as threats, we actually can start to experience things as opportunities, more opportunities for practicing, reclaiming our own sense of calm and inner peace, you could say, even amidst chaos and discomfort. So this has been probably the most valuable thing that I've learned in my life is this practice. I claim no mastery here. I've made some headway, but there's always bigger mountains to climb. And so I thought initially, I'll start with my story about recovering from Lyme disease and flourishing amid challenging times, but that's a little bit too fun and too easy. I thought I'll start it actually a couple of years prior to that and give a sort of juxtaposed, story where a time when I was doing the opposite of flourishing, you could say floundering amid what were ostensibly idyllic circumstances. So I'm going to bring you back now to 2006. I had just graduated college and I went to fulfill my lifelong dream of becoming a surf bum. So high ambitions. I moved to Maui, which was fantastic, and I did nothing. I surfed. I did a little bit of landscaping. I made the minimum, spent the minimum, and I was just there to surf every day, which is what I did. And for several months, it was great. And then interestingly, I started to feel flat. I started to feel like it wasn't giving me everything that I had hoped for. And within about 6 months' time, I found that I was becoming extremely depressed. And not only that, mentally and emotionally depressed, but things were starting to shift in my body. I was starting to feel fatigue, brain fog. Things were starting to getting aches and pains. Unexplainable things were starting to kind of shift. And then I got an injury in my knee. And I remember I got to this point, so I couldn't even surf. So I got to this point where I was feeling so beside myself. Honestly, I don't remember if I was contemplating suicide, but I do certainly remember that I was contemplating the meaning of life a whole lot. Whatever it was, I was focused on this. I was focused a lot on myself, and I didn't really have a lot of other stuff going on in terms of connections, sense of purpose. What Martin Seligman, the grandfather of positive psychology, he's put forth what he calls the PERMA model, right? And PERMA model of flourishing. And there's a few key ingredients that for me were definitely missing. And some of those are engagement, sense of achievement, relationships, connection, sense of meaning. So those things were definitely kind of had fallen by the wayside, and my body was starting to physically and mentally degenerate. So this kind of brought me back home, back to New York. And through necessity, I went to do some physical therapy for my knee. And I remember, at the time, I didn't really know exactly what to do with myself, but I remembered the words of my grandfather who said, "Follow your curiosity." And because I didn't really feel passion at that time. So I remember when I healed the knee through physical therapy, I was like, well, that's interesting that, I thought my knee was kind of broken and now it's better. So I followed that train and I got into exercise physiology, working with helping people to rehab from injuries and strokes. And I really started to actually fall in love with this idea that you could go from having an idea in your head to then doing some actual exercises that, if done consistently, would result in real physical changes, right? Physical changes to your movement patterns, your body's abilities, and how you feel and function. And so I started to really make that my career, and I went into physical fitness therapy, and in the summertime I was running a surf camp, and it was great. At the same time, with a lot of that New York type of energy, I found that I was really pushing myself very hard. Kind of like I mentioned yesterday, this peak performance, someone asked me afterwards like how I came to that idea. I said, well, through necessity. I tried to operate at a state of peak performance at all time. And at the time, I wrongfully assumed that that's what health and fitness was. And of course, everything has its limitations. So in around 2009, now several years later, I had kind of hit that limit. I had been pushing very hard, went on a surf trip in West Africa, and that's when I got incredibly sick. And it was like something had broken in me and just shifted from one day to the next. Many doctor's visits and testing and all of these things turned out to be a case of neurologic Lyme. A few people had asked me, was it the Lyme that really caused all of these problems? So, some of the problems I was experiencing were bone-on-bone arthritis. I had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. I had multiple brain lesions in the frontal cortex. I was on these heavy rounds of antibiotics. I couldn't walk. I had lost motor control, migrating aches and pains, fibromyalgia. So the list goes on. And it was interesting, to me that something like a tick bite, a small infection, could come into an otherwise what seemed like healthy 25-year-old and cause all of these issues. And I sort of came to understand it as the Lyme was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. But the camel's back might not have fully broken if it wasn't carrying such a heavy load, right? Going through life with so much resistance and angst. In European biological medicine, they have a really interesting notion of health and disease, and they put up this barrel to kind of illuminate why we get sick and why we stay sick or how we actually get better. And essentially what they show is that, as human beings, we're all incredibly resilient. We have an amazing capacity to handle a lot of shenanigans. But like any finite system, we also have our limits. And so you could think of this big barrel where maybe at the bottom, we have certain things like genetic predispositions. But we know that 2/3 of our gene expression through epigenetics is malleable. So that's not really in and of itself a problem. And then we have things like traumatic experiences, and there's been a lot of studies done on what are called the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. But we also, again, we're resilient and we have tools and ways of getting over things and getting through things. So that alone isn't necessarily sufficient. But then you add lifestyle stress and psychological stress and emotional discomfort and latent pathogenic infections, environmental toxins. And I'm saying all this not to scare anyone or make anyone like overly on edge. Again, we are incredibly resilient as human beings. But then all of these things mount up to a certain point, and then you add the insult to injury. Then you get the acute trauma or illness or infection or injury. And that can cause this sort of breaking of the dam effect, where now everything that sort of floods over the top of that barrel we experience as symptoms. And again, I mentioned that the brain's first order of business is survival. So when we find ourselves in these states, the brain will default to putting out these exaggerated survival responses in an effort to keep us safe. So let's think about the brain for a moment, and particularly a region of the brain called the limbic system. So the limbic system is responsible for threat detection and response. So it's constantly scanning the environment, the internal environment through a process called interoception, as well as the external environment through exteroception. And then based on all of the information that's coming in through the senses, including things like pathogens, our own thoughts, foods, chemicals, anything that might be coming from the environment or from even sensations within the body, the limbic system has to make a decision and a prediction. And it decides, is this safe or is this unsafe? Now, if it determines that what we're experiencing is safe, then it will default to what are called performance outputs. So it will essentially accelerate us and mobilize us to sustain good health and performance. If it decides, however, that what we're experiencing, even senses of discomfort in the body or a yelling teacher, if it determines that these are unsafe, then it will default to survival outputs. And it will increase, as we saw, levels of cortisol, epinephrine, adrenaline in the system, and essentially mobilize all of our body's resources to fight this apparent threat, whether real or imagined. So anyway, in this state, I found myself in the pretty much constant state of fight or flight, constant state of survival. It felt like there was always this ambient emergency going on that I needed to attend to, such that if I stopped attending to it, everything would just fall apart. And I remember in this one instance, someone asked yesterday, okay, so what actually changed here? And I mentioned, well, I kind of hit rock bottom, and then the wisdom of the body took over. So in this one instance, I found myself, this was around 2010 or so, maybe 2011, in New York City, ostensibly in the worst case scenario, oxygen tank, antibiotics going in, physical pain throughout my whole body, and just had already been in that state for a couple of years at the time. No vision for how I would ever get out of this. And I remember getting into this state of just pure panic, right? Just, absolute hell, you could say. And perhaps it was like in that moment that some higher wisdom took over and prompted me to do maybe the only thing that I could do, which was to just take this one deep breath. And the interesting thing is that on the other side of that breath, for the first time, maybe in my whole life, I experienced something that I think I had never experienced before. It was like this little bit of calm, this little oasis, a little, what Jacob referred to as a pocket of expansion, a space that I could actually spread out in. And after about like a tenth of a second, it passed by, and that was that. But something remained, which was the knowledge that that was there. And so I started to make a practice of this. How can I get back there? That was like my only mission. And I started taking these deep breaths more regularly, and I found that the more I practiced it, not every time, but I could actually get back there, and the more frequently I revisited that space, the wider it would get, the longer I could seem to stay there. Now the interesting thing is the more I did this, the more I started to feel more calm and a little bit more energy, a little bit more clarity. And I remember in one instance, I decided to really just go for it. So I remember kind of sitting there, taking these breaths, and in every out breath, I would exhale and just fully let go. And each time, there was a little part of me that was like, don't do that, don't let go, and I would just kind of let that part know, what, we've been down the other road before, let's try going this way and see what happens. And so I just kept going, maybe 30 or 45 minutes or so. And I remember I got to this point where it was like that last breath, that last moment, and my brain was really telling me, don't do it. And I just completely let it go. And then something pretty extraordinary happened. Seemed like my body just completely disappeared. My brain, in a sense, just like melded into the room and the floor. And I felt like I was in touch with the room and the walls around me and the buildings across the street, and everything was just this amazing, vibrating sense of like infinite space and time. And it seemed and felt like I was there for an infinite amount of time. And it was the first time in years that I experienced no pain in my body, because I couldn't experience my body, I just felt nothing. And then slowly I started to come back. I remember wiggling my fingers, and it was fine. I felt like I'd gotten what I needed from that space. And the really fascinating part is that when I came back, there was no symptoms in my body. I stood up, my legs worked, pain was gone, brain was clear. And for 3 days, I was effectively cured. There was nothing going on. So then slowly the symptoms started to creep back in, and then I looked around. I noticed in the environment, the room where I was, I still had the IV poles and the oxygen condensers and the medical papers and all this stuff. And so I was still in this environment that was reinforcing that I wasn't well, and the symptoms were kind of suggesting the same thing, and then the stories came. But again, something remained, and it was the knowledge that, you know, there was another way, and perhaps I could get back there. And so I started to research a little bit spontaneous recoveries, and turns out that there have been some legitimate cases of spontaneous remission or spontaneous recovery. And some of these have been studied at Harvard, particularly with cases of legitimate cases of multiple personality disorder, where they were able to coax someone with a certain personality into a different state. And in one state, they found that the person would have something like a severe sensitivity or allergy. In one case, it was a severe allergy or sensitivity to oranges. So in that state, the person would become inflamed, have rashes on their skin if they encountered oranges. But if coaxed into another state, into the other personality, they could literally drink orange juice and have no problem whatsoever. Yeah. But then if they reverted back into the other one, having the orange juice in their stomach, instantly they'd become inflamed and they didn't know why. So this was interesting. But the problem here is that when we talk about spontaneous recovery, and especially these multiple personality cases, they are by definition unstable conditions, right? They're unstable mental conditions. And my goal was to stabilize this. So my whole work, my whole research became about, okay, I know I can get there. I know it's possible to get back to this state of health. But how do I stabilize this? Most importantly, the question really became, what prevents us from staying there? And that's where I began to learn that it's really ultimately neural pathways. It's the brain that remembers, that learns from the past to protect us in the present and future, that can sort of like a rubber band snap us back into our reality. So it became really about starting to sever these old neural pathways to do this process of pruning. That's something I'd like to share with you now. But I thought it was an interesting kind of juxtaposition that in that moment of being completely sick with a non-positive prognosis, in that time, that instance I described, I was able to really find my highest state of happiness, really feel like I was flourishing when I was in that ultimately connected phase. And if we rewind just several years earlier, being in the most tropical paradise scenario, I found myself really in the opposite of flourishing, just in pure anguish. And so I think it depends not so much on purely the external environment, but really on the internal environment. And to me, this is really good news, because there is a tremendous amount of control that we have and things that we can do to cultivate a better internal environment. And that by doing that, we can actually affect real changes in ourselves and also, I believe, in others. So if I have another few minutes, I'll walk you through a few steps here of basically the sort of steps that we've put together over years. Essentially, it really comes down to, kind of like we did in the beginning, identifying, just tapping into an awareness of what's happening in your system, kind of taking a step back from it. So this is called interruption and disidentification, meaning that we don't overly identify with the sensations. Rather than saying, I'm anxious, we say, I'm feeling an elevated heart rate, or I'm feeling a sense of anxiety. And then we choose to do otherwise. We choose to replace it with something. So The basic steps, we'll really actually distill it down into 3 steps, and these are things that you can practice on your own. So step number 1 is to simply become aware of and interrupt whatever you're feeling in a non-judgmental way. Step number 1 is just awareness, so become aware of something. Step number 2 is to then interrupt it. And this you can do through a variety of ways. You can put up your hands and say pause, you can do a funny dance, you can do the snap, snap, clap, really whatever breaks the pattern and gets you into a new rhythm. And then step number 3, remember, you've created this space now. We've kind of relegated that unpleasant sensation to just one possibility. And so step number 3 is now to choose to focus our attention elsewhere. Wandering up and down grocery store aisles, a beach somewhere, wherever it might be. The more we can get into the sensory experience of it, the better. Sometimes visualization itself can be challenging. Fortunately, we don't just have a visual system. We have an auditory system, a kinesthetic system. We can use movement, we can use dance. At Reorigin, we use somatic experiencing, we use some breath work, we use a variety of different techniques that we can all ultimately are aimed to just get us into our body, right? This is kind of the crux of the work. And in that place, we can really inhabit this new expanded state where I truly believe that when we get out of our own way, that health and flourishing will naturally prevail. So, yeah, lastly, just wanted to mention this words of a philosopher, Kierkegaard, said that the entire world goes sour when you have a pain in your thumb, right? I think this is true, that when we experience discomfort, again, because remember the brain's first order of business is survival, it's going to be biased against discomfort. It's going to zoom in on the things that are not going well. Meanwhile, we have, I think, 9 billion bits of data coming into the senses per second, and we can only take in a very, very small sliver of that. So we have all of these other experiences that are available to us. And by realizing that that pain in the thumb that seems to be taking up our entire experience is only one option, by taking that step back, we free ourselves to expand into new territory and ultimately to flourish. So, thank you.